What's going on, guys? Dare here with Fantasy Football Advice, coming at you with another fantasy football video. Today, it's Friday, you know what time it is. It's time to go over the wide receiver starts and sits as we're heading into week 13. With the fantasy playoffs starting just next week, most of you are fighting for either your playoff spot, playoff seeding, so making the correct starts and sits this week is as important as ever. As per usual, we are going to be going matchup by matchup, letting you know a bit about each player's floor, their ceiling, so by the end of it, you'll have a good understanding of how we value each player. If you do have two wide receivers that are valued very similarly, you're not sure who to start, you can always utilize our rankings available at our website, thefantasyfootballadvice.com. Members of our website not only gain access to the rankings, you get all of our waiver information, sports betting picks, DFS picks, and more. So once again, if that interests you, that's at our website, thefantasyfootballadvice.com. Link, as always, in the description box below. Before we do jump into the video though, stat of the day. Yesterday's stat of the day was which team has the highest pass play percentage on the season. The correct answer was actually the Chicago Bears. Congratulations to Phineas Reardon, you got this one right. As for today's stat of the day, since this is a wide receiver video, we're going to switch over to wide receivers. So which receiver currently has the lowest average target distance? Once again, that's which wide receiver currently has the lowest average target distance. Leave your answer in the comment section down below. We'll be happy to let you know who wins in tomorrow's video. With all of that out of the way, let's hop right into the first matchup. The first matchup we have is the Jacksonville Jaguars. They're on the road against the Minnesota Vikings. Vikings are going to be heavy home favorites here. Projected total in this one is 52 points. We'll start with Minnesota here, and the big difference from last week to this week is that Adam Thielen was out. He was on the reserve COVID list. This week, Adam Thielen is expected to play. Adam Thielen currently leads the league in end zone targets even after missing a week. In a game against Jacksonville where they allow the 7th most fantasy points to the wide receiver position, both Adam Thielen and Justin Jefferson are going to have a lot of upside. If you guys may have been unaware, Dalvin Cook, he is currently dealing with an ankle injury. He did miss part of last week's game, but so far this week he has been practicing. It is worth noting that the last time Dalvin Cook did miss a game, Justin Jefferson and Adam Thielen completely balled out. Jefferson 9 for 166 and 2, and Adam Thielen 3 for 51 and a touchdown himself. At this point, it does look as though Dalvin Cook is trending towards playing, but if he does miss time, there could be even more opportunities for each of these wide receivers that are already in a positive matchup. Needless to say, we have them ranked as wide receiver ones this week. On the other side of the ball though, for Jacksonville, there's really only one wide receiver we could consider starting. No, it's not Colin Johnson, who is the most productive receiver while Mike Glennon was the starter. No, it's still DJ Chark. While Colin Johnson did have a good game, it's still difficult for us to just thrust him into the lineup and trust him. Mike Glennon, with a full week of practice, likely won't have as strong as a backup to backup connection. Minnesota ranks 3rd in allowing the most fantasy points to the position, so consider DJ Chark a starter and a top 30 option this week. The next matchup we have is the Las Vegas Raiders versus the New York Jets. Not a lot of true difference makers from a fantasy perspective in this matchup. On the Raiders side of the ball, unfortunately, we can't trust any of the wide receivers. Even in the flex, it doesn't make a ton of sense. Yes, you could chase this matchup. The Jets do give up the 5th most fantasy points to wide receivers, but 2 of the past 3 weeks, they did not allow a single receiving touchdown to a wide receiver. 2 of those teams were New England and Miami, so not really strong teams offensively, but at the same time, it's the Las Vegas Raiders we're talking about in this matchup. None of the wide receivers, not Nelson Aguilar nor Henry Ruggs, is getting consistent volume. For that reason, we recommend you leaving both of them on the bench this week. And for the New York Jets, we believe you'll fare a little bit better trusting one of these players. There are 3 to choose from that are valued very similarly. Jamison Crowder, the receiver who's been most trending down from a volume and involvement perspective. Denzel Mims, the receiver that's been trending up the most. Then also Brashad Perriman, who's been the most consistent and productive receiver as of late. Each one of these players we do have ranked outside the top 36, but still within the top 45. The upside that Crowder brings to the table now has been a bit more questionable. We do still have Perriman ranked ahead of Mims, but that could change over the next coming weeks, so we'll move into the next one. Cleveland Browns on the road against Tennessee. This game has a pretty high projected total at 54 points. A.J. Brown, Corey Davis, they're both good starts in this matchup. A.J. Brown has now caught at least one receiving touchdown in 7 of his last 8 contests. The Tennessee Titans should have no problem moving the ball up and down the field with Derrick Henry, so the scoring opportunities for both A.J. Brown and Corey Davis in this matchup, they are pretty high. Corey Davis, his overall volume has been trending down a bit. We see in these big Derrick Henry games, Corey Davis doesn't have as much volume as we would like, but regardless, you can start him safely as a wide receiver 3, a top 30 option this week, and A.J. Brown can be comfortably started as a wide receiver 2. For Cleveland, it's pretty simple. It's Jarvis Landry and nobody else. Jarvis Landry is coming off of an 11-target game. Those 11 targets he translated into 8 receptions, 143 yards, and even scored a touchdown. By far, it was his best fantasy performance of the season. It was against a weak Jacksonville Jaguars pass defense, and once again, in Week 13, they get yet another soft passing matchup. Jarvis Landry is a top 30 option as well. Start him as a high-floor wide receiver 3. The next matchup we have is the Detroit Lions versus the Chicago Bears. There was a bit of hope that Kenny Golladay would be able to crack the starting lineup this week, but it seems like his practices have been trending the opposite direction, so we don't have him ranked as starting this week, which makes Marvin Jones once again another solid start. Jones over the past 3 weeks has been averaging over 9 targets per game, and even though the Chicago Bears, they're a very stingy passing defense, they still over the past 2 weeks have allowed a multi-TD game to wide receivers in each contest, and at least one receiving touchdown in 5 of the last 7. Marvin Jones has a good chance to score in this matchup, and considering he should be seeing the bulk of the volume in this game, his floor should be relatively high as well. We're starting him as a back-end wide receiver 2, high-end wide receiver 3. No other Detroit receiver should we be considering starting in this game, but as for Chicago, Allen Robinson is a locked and loaded wide receiver 1, 13 targets last week, tied for the second highest on the season, and that was with Mitchell Trubisky starting. Mitchell Trubisky has been named the starter once again in this week's matchup. This week's matchup against Detroit should be very fruitful. In their past 6 games, Detroit has allowed 20 plus receptions to wide receivers in half of their contests through that span. Allen Robinson, who's now had 2 13 plus target games with Mitchell Trubisky, he should be a very high floor wide receiver 1 option this week, and despite the positive matchup for possibly the other receivers like Darnell Mooney or Anthony Miller, we're still going to be avoiding starting them even in what's a plus matchup. The next matchup we have is the New Orleans Saints versus the Atlanta Falcons. It may surprise a lot of you to see that this has a modest total of just 46 points. Typically, the Drew Brees and Michael Thomas led Saints with a healthy Alvin Kamara in a matchup against Julio Jones and Calvin Ridley of the Falcons would bring in a ton of fireworks, but this week we have nothing of the sort. Taysom Hill is the starter, and while he did play very well against Atlanta in their first matchup, he struggled a bit in the passing game last week against Denver, completing only 9 passes for just 70 plus yards. While the Atlanta Falcons pass defense is much weaker than that of Denver's, the floor for a player like Michael Thomas may be lower than what we saw 2 weeks ago in the first matchup against Atlanta, because now that defense knows what to expect from Taysom Hill, and we already saw Taysom Hill struggle a bit in the passing attack just last week. We still suggest that you start Michael Thomas as a high-end 2, back-end 1 option, but on the other side, for Atlanta, Julio Jones, it's unknown if he is going to play at this time. If he doesn't, Calvin Ridley would be more of a high-end wide receiver 1 option. Even without Julio Jones last week, though, he did only receive 9 targets. We would like to potentially see a higher ceiling for him in these games without Julio, but regardless, with or without him, he should be an auto lock in your lineup. Even if Julio doesn't play, though, we're not going to start any other wide receiver in this matchup. It has a low total. No other receiver has been getting consistent enough volume for us to trust, so for that, it's either Calvin Ridley, Julio Jones if he plays, and nobody else. The next matchup we have Miami Dolphins versus the Cincinnati Bengals. The big questions in this one is who's going to be starting. Is it going to be Ryan Fitzpatrick or Tua? At this point, we do have to assume it's going to be Ryan Fitzpatrick, and we know that definitely benefits a player named Devontae Parker. Devontae Parker this week does crack our top 20. We have him as a mid-grade wide receiver 2 in this matchup, and simply put, the passing volume with Ryan Fitzpatrick, it's higher, it's much more efficient, and we do know that there is a target funnel with Ryan Fitzpatrick that favors wide receivers. receivers. No other Miami Dolphins receiver we would be considering starting though, so we'll move over to Cincinnati, which unfortunately does have a less than favorable quarterback situation than they had earlier on in the season. Neither Higgins nor Boyd we have ranked inside the top 30. That's not a testament to exactly how strong Miami's defense is, more of a testament to just the ambiguity coming from this offense, so trusting either of them as anything more than a flex is probably going to be adding too much risk to your team. Can they succeed? Definitely. Is the floor much lower? 100%. We're moving into the next one. It's the Indianapolis Colts on the road against the Houston Texans. This game has a 51-point projected total, and Indianapolis is coming into this game as a road favorite. When it comes to Indianapolis, the only receiver we're trusting is going to be Michael Pittman. Yes, I know T.Y. Hilton did have a good game, but we've had a large enough sample size of T.Y. Hilton to know we're not going to trust him even in a soft passing matchup like we have this week against Houston. As for Pittman, although people would consider his last week's performance a bust, 2 receptions for 28 yards, I believe you have to look a little bit deeper and see that he received a whopping 9 targets. 9 targets was the most amount of targets he's received on any game this season. In the potential and ability we had seen in the prior 2 weeks, 66 yards and a touchdown in week 11, 7 for 101 in week 10. If he's receiving that amount of volume against a weak passing defense like Houston, Michael Pittman has a ton of upside this week. We have him ranked inside the top 25, which may sound a bit egregious, but we feel confident in Michael Pittman this week. On the other side of the ball for Houston, the big news is that Will Fuller is out for 6 games due to suspension for PEDs. This leaves Brandon Cooks, Kiki Kuti as the primary pass catchers for this offense. The other weapons in this passing offense are either suspended or injured, so the passing game is going to go through both of them, making both of them viable starts this week. Kuti more of a high-risk, questionable ceiling flex play, maybe a desperation play. And Brandon Cooks, while he'll most likely be ranked closer to a wide receiver 1 in the coming weeks, in this week's matchup against Indianapolis, who is quite stingy against wide receivers, we do have to rank him as a mid to back end wide receiver too. The next matchup we have is the LA Rams versus the Arizona Cardinals. This one's pretty simple. We'll start with the Cardinals. We're starting DeAndre Hopkins, no question about that. The only other wide receiver we're considering starting is Christian Kirk. And yes, I understand this is a matchup against the Los Angeles Rams, the team that allows the least fantasy points to the wide receiver position, but at the same time, there's no Larry Fitzgerald. There should be more passing volume and potential shots for Christian Kirk deep downfield. Christian Kirk is the type of player who only needs 1 in order to pay off a start, so putting him in as a high-risk flex player is something we can condone even in a tough matchup. On the other side of the ball, it's also pretty simple because Robert Woods, Cooper Kupp, they're the only 2 receivers on this team we're considering starting, and both of which we do have ranked as wide receiver 2s. Just to overall set your expectations, we do have Cooper Kupp ranked higher than Robert Woods, and while Cooper Kupp is trending downwards, so to speak, on a production standpoint when looking at last game, then when you compare it to Robert Woods, who's had double-digit targets in each of his last 2, yes, we're not denying Robert Woods does have the safer floor of both of those players, but if this game does turn into any form of a shootout, it's not necessarily expected, especially with this total, but both teams that do have offensive firepower, it's definitely a possibility, and in those games, Cooper Kupp brings in a bunch more upside than that of Robert Woods. The ceiling for Kupp is much higher than Woods, both of which make good starts this week, which is exactly why we have them both ranked as wide receiver 2s in this matchup. Up next, New York Giants on the road against the Seattle Seahawks. This game has a 48-point projected total, with Seattle Seahawks as 10-point home favorites. Now, even with Seattle as heavy home favorites, we're not going to fade or question Tyler Lockett or DK Metcalf. DK Metcalf, we have ranked inside the top 3. Tyler Lockett, he's inside the top 12. So we'll move over to the New York Giants, which I think bring in a surprising amount of upside this week. Seattle being 10-point favorites, it's likely going to lead New York Giants into an early deficit, forcing the passing volume to be higher than expected, and Sterling Shepard, already a player receiving a hefty amount of volume, playing from behind against a defense that allows the most fantasy points to the position, he's definitely a high floor option that actually brings in the ceiling as well this week. Sterling Shepard has had 8 or more targets in 4 of his last 5 contests, and while he hasn't scored in the past 4 weeks, he's had no fewer than 6 receptions over each of his last 5 games, and I'd say has a really solid chance to score this week. We have him ranked as a solid wide receiver 3 option. As for Darius Slayton, the only other receiver we would consider starting, he's a high risk, high reward flex play. His volume or lack thereof has came at the expense of Sterling Shepard and his return to health. We know the talent that comes along with Darius Slayton and the opportunity this defense presents, but with a game 3 weeks ago with just 1 target and coming off last week's game of just 2 targets, it's difficult to trust such a low amount of volume. The next matchup we have is the Philadelphia Eagles versus the Green Bay Packers, and this one couldn't be more simple because there's really only one receiver that we should be able to trust in our lineups. That receiver, of course, is the great Devontae Adams. We have him ranked as the #1 overall receiver on the entire week. I could understand some of you also wanting to start Lazard. If you're desperate, I could definitely understand it. It is a much softer matchup than he faced last week, and last week he did get a respectable 6 targets. That's not a hefty amount of volume, but he did catch 4 of them and even caught a receiving touchdown. We don't have him ranked in flex territory. That just comes down to the ease in which Aaron Rodgers should be able to distribute the football this week as opposed to last week. So the risk, it may not be worth the reward that you get in return. As for the Eagles, even though they are likely to be playing from behind in this entire matchup, they just have a ton of weapons, nobody's getting consistent volume, and quite frankly, none of them have really been looking all that great. The next matchup we have is the New England Patriots versus the LA Chargers. For New England, there really is one receiver that we're beginning to trust. That's Jacoby Myers. Myers, of course, was the receiver in the middle weeks we did see flashes from, with 2 games back-to-back with a combined 24 targets, a game with 12 receptions and 169 yards. Well, last week, he did only receive 6 targets, which was on the low end since his hot streak, but in the same time, he converted 5 of 6 of those targets into receptions for 52 yards. N'Keal Harry, the only receiving threat to take away volume from him in the receiving game, he ranks near the bottom of the league in catchable target percentage. The chemistry, obviously, with him and Newton, it isn't all that high. So Jacoby Myers is the only New England receiver we're considering starting. You can trust him as a back-end wide receiver 2, high-end wide receiver 3. We believe he has top 20 upside this week. And as for the Chargers, Keenan Allen, an auto start each and every week. We have him ranked inside the top 5. And as for Mike Williams, yes, he's coming off of a bad game, but he's already shown the type of upside we're looking for when deciding on who to plug in our flexes. The New England Patriots, yes, they played very stingy against Arizona in the passing attack last week, but the 3 games prior to that, they actually allowed 7 receiving touchdowns in 3 games to wide receivers. That ranks near the top of the league through that span. So to say that this defense isn't susceptible to be beaten through the air, that fact is just simply not true. Mike Williams, he does have some upside in this game. We do have him ranked just outside the top 40, but an upside flex player you should be considering this week. The next game we have is the Denver Broncos versus the Kansas City Chiefs. In this one for Kansas City, it's pretty simple. We're only starting Tyreek Hill. Sammy Watkins did return from injury and return to action this past week. That does open the door to the potential of maybe playing him. He did receive 7 targets in that contest, but this week against the Denver Broncos, there's no guarantee he'll see as much volume. While the floor and the ceiling for players like Tyreek Hill and Travis Kelce will remain untouched, a support role player like Sammy Watkins, his type of role is going to have a bit more volatility to it. Not only is his health a contributing factor to the risk associated with his start, but also if the Chiefs get up to a pretty sizable lead, his volume in the late game and second half, it may not be as high as it was in the first 2 quarters. For this, we can't recommend starting him as anything more than a high-risk flex play. And on the other side of the ball for Jerry Jeudy, he's coming off of a complete dud, and while it's not all his fault, Drew Lock has been playing much worse than he did when he started to heat up, throwing 5 touchdowns in a 2-game span. Since then, he's had 1 passing touchdown over the last 2 contests. The floor and the ceiling in this matchup, even though it's against Kansas City, even though they are expected to be trailing, it's going to be much lower. So for that, we do have to recommend starting Jerry Jeudy at your own risk. The next game we have is the Washington football team on the road against the Pittsburgh Steelers. For Washington, of course, Terry McLaurin, the only player we're considering starting. We did bump him a bit down in the rankings. And no, it's not because the Pittsburgh Steelers have been a strong passing defense for the entire season. In fact, they've been one of the worst defenses at defending opposing wide receivers, but as of late, they've been trending in the other direction. In the past 2 contests, they've allowed a combined 14 receptions, just 1 receiving touchdown, and let's be frank, Washington football team, they don't really have that powerful of an offense. This game has the potential to look vastly different than what we saw on Thanksgiving Day against Dallas in that weak defense, and while Terry McLaurin has been on a tear in the last 2 quarterbacks that have faced Pittsburgh, they haven't brought in a lot of talent. The high floor option of Terry McLaurin McLaurin is going to get a ranking of a high-end wide receiver 2 this week. On the other side, for Pittsburgh, we also have to temper our expectations. The Washington football team is a top 3 defense at mitigating fantasy points to the wide receiver position. This game also has a total of a mere 44 points, and the Pittsburgh Steelers, they are projected to be 10-point favorites. Heavy favorites like that, it does indicate a potential late game run heavy game script, which could be at the detriment of the receivers on this team, all of which still in play, all of which top 30 options, but their floors and ceilings are going to be a bit lower in this contest than they would be in other matchups. Deontay does crack the top 20, Claypool the top 24, and Juju Smith-Schuster, he does round out, still being ranked inside the top 30 though. Moving into the next matchup, we have the Buffalo Bills on the road against the San Francisco 49ers. San Francisco is still going to be a 2.5 point home underdog in this one. Last week, San Francisco, short of weapons, did get Debo back in his first game. He had an immense amount of volume, 13 targets. He converted 11 of those into receptions for 133 yards, which shows you the amount of upside he's going to bring to the table this week against Buffalo. He will once again be one of the only healthy receivers that this offense can rely upon. So we have him ranked as a wide receiver 2. Brandon Ayuk is also another guy who's in play this week. He received 14 targets, converting 7 of them for 75 yards and a touchdown. And although we're not as bullish on Ayuk as we are on Debo this week for this specific matchup, we still do have Brandon Ayuk ranked as the wide receiver 26 for this upcoming matchup. On the other side of the ball for Buffalo, John Brown, he is currently on IR. This leaves Cole Beasley as a high floor flex option for you and likely to be one for the remainder of the season. If you're in PPR leagues, this is a player who already ranks inside the top 25 on the season. We don't really see his ceiling games that often, but against a tough matchup like San Francisco, it's definitely the type of matchup a player like Cole Beasley can exploit. As for Diggs, you don't need me to tell you he's a top 10 option this week, so we'll go right into the next matchup, the final matchup, Dallas versus Baltimore. The big news in this one would probably be relying on Lamar Jackson and his health. If he starts, Marquise Brown would be a bit more appealing. This is a positive matchup, of course, against Dallas, but even so, even if Lamar Jackson starts, I just find it really difficult to trust Marquise Brown, especially this close to the playoffs. For that, I'm recommending you guys leave him on the bench this week. On the other side of the ball, even though this is a tough matchup, CeeDee Lamb and Amari Cooper, they are still in play. If Lamar Jackson somehow is not able to suit up and remains on the COVID list, I would say the upside for Cooper and CeeDee Lamb is going to be even higher. If the offense of Baltimore does struggle, the time of possession may not be as heavy in favorite of the Baltimore Ravens as it typically would with Lamar, so that would increase the overall ceiling for those players. Their floor would remain about similar, but still would make them better starts nonetheless. CeeDee Lamb we have ranked as a top 36 option. Amari Cooper, a wide receiver 2, just outside the top 20, so both players you should be getting into your lineup regardless of the tough matchup. But guys, that's going to do it for this video. We really hope you enjoyed. If you did, how about hitting that like button? If you're new to the channel, please hit that subscribe button. We thank you all for watching, and we'll catch you on the next one.